On the evening of March 7, 1979, at approximately 7:22 p.m., Margaret Louise Reilly was in the kitchen of her split-level home on Larchmont Drive in Silver Spring, Maryland, washing the dinner dishes when her telephone rang. The call lasted no more than 12 seconds. By the time she had dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle and walked the 7 steps to where the telephone sat on the counter, the voice on the other end had already begun speaking. It was a man's voice. The accent was faintly foreign in a way she could not immediately place. He spoke with a deliberateness that struck her afterward as rehearsed, as if reading from a card. The project at the river had been authorized, the voice said. Saturday, as planned. 3 stops, not 2. Then, after a pause of perhaps 2 seconds during which Reilly said nothing, the voice asked whether she understood. She told him she thought he had the wrong number. The line went dead immediately. Reilly, 52 years old, stood holding the receiver for a moment before replacing it in its cradle. She was a widow. Her husband, Frank Reilly, had died of a heart attack in 1974, and she lived alone in the house they had purchased together in 1966. She worked as an administrative coordinator in the Support Services Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Washington Field Office, a position she had held for 14 years. She was not a special agent. She processed procurement requests, managed scheduling for administrative personnel, and handled correspondence. Her day-to-day work had very little to do with active investigations, but 14 years in an FBI office had given her a certain awareness of how things worked, a familiarity with the vocabulary of surveillance and counterintelligence that the average citizen did not possess. She stood in her kitchen for approximately a minute, thinking. The phrase "the project at the river" meant nothing to her. Saturday and 3 stops meant nothing to her. But the accent, the rehearsed quality of the delivery, the immediate hang-up when she had indicated confusion, these details arranged themselves in her mind in a way she could not dismiss. At 7:34 p.m., she called the Washington Field Office's after-hours duty number and asked to speak with whoever was on duty for the counterintelligence squad. The agent who answered was Special Agent Howard Garrett, 41 years old, who had been working Soviet counterintelligence cases for 7 years. Reilly described the call. Garrett listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked 2 questions: exactly what time the call had come in, and whether she had noticed anything else distinctive about the caller's voice or the background sound on the line. If you follow cases like this one, where a single moment of carelessness unravels years of carefully hidden intelligence work, subscribe and turn on notifications. Each week, this channel traces one Cold War story from its opening thread to its final consequence, following the documented record wherever it leads. Now, back to Silver Spring, and a 12-second telephone call that was never supposed to reach Margaret Reilly at all. What she could not have known that evening was that the call had been intended for someone else entirely, that a single transposed digit had redirected it from its intended destination to her kitchen counter. By the time the consequences of that misdialed number had fully played out, a family in Falls Church, Virginia, would be broken in ways that would never completely repair. Thomas Edward Hartley was born on February 11th, 1933, in Akron, Ohio, the second of 3 children born to Walter Hartley, an accountant for a rubber manufacturing company, and Constance Hartley, née Morrow, who had been a school teacher before her marriage. Walter Hartley's position was stable if unremarkable, and the household it supported was typical of working-class Akron in the post-war years. A narrow frame house in the city's eastern section, seasonal rhythms tied to the school calendar and the manufacturing economy, a particular emphasis on academic achievement that Constance instilled in her children and that shaped what became of them. Thomas Hartley did well in school. By the time he graduated from Garfield High School in 1951, he had demonstrated a particular aptitude for languages and mathematics, taking advanced courses in both while serving, somewhat incongruously, as a starting forward on the school's basketball team. He enrolled at Ohio State University on an academic scholarship, intending initially to study mathematics. During his sophomore year, he switched his major to international relations, a shift that reflected a growing interest in the geopolitical questions that dominated American life in the early 1950s, the Korean War, the the Soviet nuclear program, the emerging confrontations of what was already being called the Cold War. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army upon completing his undergraduate degree in 1955, having participated in the Reserve Officers Training Corps throughout his 4 years at Ohio State. He served 2 tours of duty, the first at a signals intelligence unit in West Germany, where his work involved the interception and analysis of Warsaw Pact military communications. It was during this posting, from 1956 to 1958, that Hartley first encountered the classified world in a significant way: the monitoring of encrypted Soviet military radio traffic, the painstaking work of traffic analysis, the quiet intensity of men who spent their working hours listening to the communications of a potential enemy. The work suited him in a way that few things had before. After his Army service, Hartley returned to Ohio State for graduate work in international security studies. Completing a master's degree in 1962, he met Barbara Ann Collins at a faculty reception in the spring of 1961. She was 26, working as a librarian at the university's main library, having studied library science at Ohio Wesleyan. By all accounts, she was an organized, quietly determined woman who balanced a careful reserve in public with a warmth that those close to her found considerable. They were married in September 1962 at a Catholic church in Columbus, where Barbara's family had lived for 3 generations. In 1963, Hartley was recruited by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense's primary intelligence analysis organization, which had been formally established in 1961. He was assigned initially to the Soviet Military Capabilities Section, working at the DIA's offices at Arlington Hall Station in Arlington, Virginia, a former school campus converted to intelligence use during World War II, and one of the Washington area's more consequential bureaucratic addresses. The work aligned directly with what he had done in Germany, assessing Soviet military strength, capabilities, and intentions, drawing on signals intelligence, imagery, and human intelligence reporting to produce finished analytical products used by military commanders and senior policymakers. The family settled in Falls Church, Virginia, purchasing a 4-bedroom colonial revival house on West Haven Drive in 1967 after several years of apartment living. The house sat on a 3-acre lot in a neighborhood of similar houses, with mature oak trees lining the street and a school a 7-minute walk away. Their daughter Joanne had been born in 1960. Before Hartley joined the DIA, their son Kevin was born in 1963. By 1967, Joanne was 7 and Kevin was 4, and the household had the rhythms common to families of their kind and era: school schedules, weekend grocery trips, summer vacations to Barbara's family in Columbus or to the Maryland shore. Hartley commuted approximately 11 miles each way to Arlington Hall Station, typically leaving the house at 7:10 in the morning and returning between 6:15 and 6:45 in the evening, depending on workload. His security clearance had been elevated to top secret in 1965 and to sensitive compartmented information in 1968, reflecting his growing responsibilities and the sensitivity of the programs he worked on. By the early 1970s, he held the civil service rank of GS-14, a senior analytical position, and was regarded within his division as one of the more capable assessors of Soviet strategic military developments. Colleagues who were later interviewed by FBI investigators described Hartley as intelligent, somewhat introverted, and deeply knowledgeable about his subject matter. Several used the word intense to describe his engagement with his work, noting that he appeared to take analytical questions seriously in a way that went beyond professional obligation, that he genuinely believed the accuracy of American intelligence assessments about Soviet capabilities had direct consequences for the risk of nuclear war. One colleague recalled a conversation in the late 1960s in which Hartley had argued, with some heat, that overestimates of Soviet military strength were as dangerous as underestimates, that inflated threat assessments drove military spending and posturing that could provoke the very responses they were meant to deter. This was not an uncommon view among analysts of his generation and background, and it reflected genuine intellectual concerns about the feedback loops between intelligence assessment and strategic decision-making. But it also reflected, as would become apparent later, a political orientation that made Hartley susceptible to certain arguments that would be made to him in a very different context, by a very different kind of interlocutor, at a hotel conference room in Boston in the spring of 1972. The conference was a 3-day academic gathering on strategic arms limitations, held at a hotel near Boston's Back Bay in April 1972. During the final weeks of the SALT-I negotiations, the arms control agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union that would be formally signed the following month on May 26th, placing the first binding caps on offensive ballistic missiles and anti-ballistic missile systems. Hartley attended as a representative of the DIA's analytical staff, presenting a paper on the verification challenges associated with monitoring treaty compliance through satellite imagery and signals collection. The paper was unclassified. It drew on publicly available information and was intended for an academic audience that included arms control researchers, graduate students, and policy analysts from think tanks and universities. On the second evening of the conference, at a reception held in the hotel's dining room, Hartley was approached by a man who introduced himself as Jeffrey Banks. Banks described himself as a researcher at a Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and said he had found Hartley's presentation that afternoon particularly interesting, especially the section dealing with the methodological challenges of distinguishing treaty-compliant from non-compliant missile configurations using satellite imagery alone. The conversation was substantive and, from Hartley's later account, intellectually engaging. Banks appeared genuinely knowledgeable about the technical dimensions of arms control verification and asked questions that reflected serious familiarity with the literature. They spoke for approximately 45 minutes. Banks suggested that Hartley might be interested in a symposium his institute was planning for the following spring. They exchanged business cards. FBI investigators would later determine that Jeffrey Banks was almost certainly a false identity maintained by an officer of the KGB's First Chief Directorate, the foreign intelligence arm responsible for recruiting and handling human assets in Western countries. The Canadian institute he claimed to represent did not exist at the address printed on his business card. His real name was never definitively established, though investigators developed a working hypothesis that he was a Soviet intelligence officer who had been operating under various cover identities in North America for several years before the Boston Conference. The relationship that developed over the following 18 months had the careful, gradual quality typical of Soviet intelligence recruitment operations. Banks maintained contact through letters and occasional telephone calls, always referencing academic or policy topics, and never moving abruptly into territory that might alarm Hartley or trigger his security awareness. He sent articles and monographs. He expressed admiration for a subsequent paper Hartley published in an academic journal. He eventually suggested they meet again, arranging encounters at 2 further conferences, one in Washington and one in Toronto. It was at the Toronto meeting in November 1973 that the conversation crossed the line. According to Hartley's later account in FBI debriefings conducted in late 1979 and into 1980, Banks had raised the subject of analytical bias in American intelligence, the ways in which institutional incentives and Cold War ideological frameworks might cause American assessors to skew their evaluations of Soviet intentions in directions that served the arguments of those seeking increased military budgets. Hartley had engaged with this argument on intellectual terms, as he had before. Banks then suggested something more specific, that it might be possible to reduce the risk of miscalculation, the ever-present fear in that era of one side misreading the other's capabilities or intentions and stumbling into a catastrophic military exchange, if certain American analytical conclusions were shared with Soviet counterparts who were, Banks suggested, equally concerned about preventing exactly that kind of catastrophe. The argument was sophisticated enough, and Hartley's concerns about analytical distortion were genuine enough that he did not immediately refuse. He asked questions. He considered. He returned to Virginia having said nothing definitively. And then, over the weeks that followed, he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He agreed initially to share what he described to himself as analytical judgments rather than raw intelligence, his assessments of Soviet military postures rather than the classified source material on which those assessments were based. This distinction, which may have seemed meaningful to him at the time, was in practice meaningless. His assessments were themselves classified, based on sources and methods among the most sensitive in the U.S. intelligence community, and capable of revealing to Soviet intelligence precisely what American analysts knew and believed about Soviet capabilities. The line between sharing judgments and sharing intelligence was one that Hartley had constructed for himself, and it did not survive contact with the operational reality of what he was doing. The operational structure that Banks established for handling Hartley's information was, by FBI accounts compiled later, competent and methodical. Hartley was given a contact number, not a direct line to anyone in the Soviet intelligence structure, but a cutout, a relay point maintained by a support network that would pass messages and arrange exchanges. He received a set of basic tradecraft instructions: how to detect surveillance, how to use dead drops, how to signal readiness for an exchange using specific notations within the classified section of a Washington newspaper. The signals were designed to look entirely mundane: an advertisement for a used lawnmower, a notice about piano lessons, under categories no counterintelligence analyst would think to monitor. The dead drops themselves were, according to Hartley's FBI debriefings, located at rotating sites across a geographic area encompassing Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and portions of Washington, D.C. itself. Hartley would leave materials, documents he had photographed using a Minox subminiature camera purchased through the mail using a false name, at designated locations, beneath a loose concrete cap, on a drainage culvert in Annandale, Virginia, behind a specific brick in a retaining wall near the C&O Canal in Georgetown, under a park bench at a specific position in Cabin John Regional Park in Montgomery County, Maryland. The information he provided over roughly 6 years, from late 1973 to early 1979, spanned some of the most sensitive analytical work the DIA produced during that period. He provided Soviet intelligence with assessments of American estimates of Soviet ICBM accuracy and throw weight, essentially telling them what American analysts believed the Soviet strategic missile force was capable of, which itself revealed insights into American intelligence collection capabilities. He provided assessments of how the U.S. military evaluated Soviet air defense systems. He provided documents outlining American analytical methodology for assessing Warsaw Pact conventional force readiness in Central Europe. In total, FBI investigators would later conclude he had compromised 43 separate classified analytical products over the course of his operation, including materials rated at the sensitive compartmented information level, among the highest classification designations in use. The financial compensation was not insubstantial, but was not, according to Hartley's own account, the primary driver. Over 6 years, he received approximately $48,000 in cash, delivered through the dead drop system in sealed envelopes, an average of roughly $8,000 per year. The money was deposited in small amounts across accounts at several different banks, in transactions calibrated to avoid triggering financial reporting requirements. Some went toward ordinary household expenses during lean periods. Some went toward a boat he kept at a marina on the Potomac River in Alexandria, a purchase that Barbara attributed to her husband's need to decompress from the pressures of work, which it also in some genuine measure was. What the money did not fully account for was the psychological compensation that Hartley himself would describe, with evident difficulty, during his FBI debriefing sessions. Multiple sessions, conducted across several months, consistently revealed that he had experienced significant intellectual and emotional satisfaction from the relationship with his Soviet handlers, that he had come to feel valued in ways his actual DIA career, with its bureaucratic rhythms and institutional frustrations, did not always provide, and that the operational elements of his espionage had become significant to him beyond whatever rationale he had constructed to justify them. This was not, by Hartley's own later reckoning, something he had fully understood about himself at the time. That understanding would take decades to arrive, and it would arrive in a form more uncomfortable than anything he had imagined. Barbara Hartley knew none of this. The boat was her husband's hobby. The occasional evenings when he seemed distracted or preoccupied she attributed to the demands of a stressful job that she knew, from the security procedures she had observed over the years, involved carrying information he could not share with anyone, including her. This was true. What she did not know was that what he was carrying was also being shared with people she had not been told about. On the evening of March 7th, 1979, the KGB officer responsible for the Hartley case, a man named Viktor Alexandrovich Menshov, 39 years old, who held the diplomatic title of Second Secretary in the Political Affairs section of the Soviet Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Northwest Washington, was scheduled to make a routine contact call according to the established operational schedule. Menshov had been Hartley's primary handler for approximately 18 months, having taken over the account from a predecessor who had rotated out of Washington in the fall of 1977. The contact protocol required Menshov to call a specific telephone number at a specific time. The number belonged to a dry cleaning establishment in Wheaton, Maryland, a small business operated by a Soviet intelligence support asset whose function was to receive and relay messages. When Menshov called, the owner would receive the message and pass it to Hartley through a separate channel. The number Menshov intended to call was 301-946-2748. The number he actually dialed from a pay telephone on Virginia Avenue near the Watergate complex was 301-946-2478, a transposition of 2 digits in the final sequence. Whether the error was caused by distraction, ambient noise near the payphone, or simply a momentary lapse in attention, Menshov appears to have been unaware of the mistake until the wrong voice answered. His response was to complete the message before the discrepancy fully registered, then to terminate the call immediately when the woman who answered indicated she did not understand. He would have returned to the embassy and notified his supervisors, initiating an internal security assessment of whether the misdial had exposed operational information. The answer was yes, not immediately, and not in the way Menshov would have anticipated. Howard Garrett received Margaret Reilly's call at 7:34 p.m. His initial assessment was professionally measured. He took down the details, asked her to call again if she received any further unusual calls, and told her someone would follow up the following morning. He was not dismissive. 14 years at the FBI had taught him that administrative staff sometimes noticed things that trained investigators missed, but he was also aware that wrong number calls to private residences were not, on their face, significant events. What shifted his assessment was a detail Reilly mentioned almost as an afterthought. The phrase "the project at the river" had appeared in an unclassified document she had processed several months earlier, something related to a Soviet-managed exchange program. She could not recall the specifics, and the connection was almost certainly coincidental. Unclassified cultural exchange programs routinely reference rivers and locations, but the combination of factors, the foreign accented voice, the rehearsed phrasing, the immediate hang-up, was enough for Garrett to flag the report as something worth passing up the chain. He did so the following morning, March 8, 1979, briefing Supervisory Special Agent Donald Marsh, 53 years old, who supervised the Soviet counterintelligence squad at the Washington field office. Marsh was, by the accounts of colleagues who spoke with investigators and researchers in later years, a patient and systematic investigator who had been working Soviet cases since the early 1960s. He had a particular expertise in identifying the signatures of KGB communication protocols, the patterns of timing, phrasing, and channel use that tended to recur across different operations even when the specific content changed. Marsh ordered a telephone records request. The records, returned within 2 business days, showed that Reilly's home telephone had received a call on the evening of March 7th at 7:22 p.m., lasting 12 seconds, originating from a pay telephone at a street corner on Virginia Avenue in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood of Washington, D.C. approximately 6 blocks from the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue. This was not conclusive. Pay telephones on Virginia Avenue were used by dozens of people daily, but it shifted the assessment. Marsh requested a cross-reference of existing surveillance records for known Soviet intelligence personnel against documented movements on the evening of March 7th. The Washington field office maintained rolling coverage on a rotating roster of suspected KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover, and those records needed to be reviewed against a 12-minute window when the call had been placed. The process required 11 days. On March 19, 1979, a surveillance analyst working under Marsh identified a pattern. On the afternoon and evening of March 7th, Viktor Alexandrovich Menshov, the Soviet embassy's second secretary for political affairs, flagged in FBI records as a probable KGB officer based on signals, intelligence, and behavioral indicators, had been documented leaving the embassy in his personal vehicle at approximately 6:45 p.m. and driving south and east from Wisconsin Avenue before dropping off the surveillance team's tracking in the Foggy Bottom area at approximately 7:10 p.m. This was a standard operational signature for a KGB officer conducting a contact call, driving a circuitous route to detect surveillance before using a public telephone. Menshov had returned to the embassy at approximately 7:50 p.m. The timing placed him in the Foggy Bottom area during the window when the call to Reilly's number had been made. The FBI could not prove that Menshov had made the specific call. It remained possible that he had used a different telephone during the gap in coverage, or that the call had been placed by someone else entirely, but the circumstantial alignment was significant enough to authorize the next step. If Menshov had made the call, he had been trying to reach someone. The question was who. The investigative process that followed was, by necessity, indirect. The FBI could not ask Menshov who he had been calling. They could not search his files or communications without triggering a diplomatic incident and alerting the KGB that the operation had been detected. What they could do was work backward from the number Menshov had apparently intended to dial. The most common type of dialing error involves transposing adjacent digits. Reversing that transposition from the number Menshov had actually called, 301-946-2478, pointed to a single probable intended number, 301-946-2748. This number was registered to the Wheaton Fine Cleaners, a dry cleaning establishment at a strip mall on Georgia Avenue in Wheaton, Maryland, operated by a man named Peter Havlicek, 58 years old, a naturalized U.S. citizen, originally from Czechoslovakia, who had immigrated in 1968 following the Soviet-led invasion that ended the Prague Spring. He had established the dry cleaning business in 1971. A discreet background check of Havlicek through existing FBI records and CIA files produced an indicator that had been logged but never pursued. A record of a meeting in Montreal in the summer of 1974 between Havlicek and an individual, tentatively identified as a Czech intelligence officer. The file had been flagged for follow-up and had subsequently fallen through administrative gaps, never investigated further. This now became significant. If Havlicek's business was operating as a cutout, a relay point for KGB communications, then the question became who, among the population of persons with access to sensitive U.S. government information, might be in contact with his establishment in a non-obvious way. Covert surveillance of the Wheaton Fine Cleaners began on March 25, 1979, conducted in a way designed not to alert Havlicek or anyone associated with him. For the first 2 weeks, nothing notable occurred. Havlicek ran his business normally, dealing with customers, managing his 2 employees, and maintaining the unremarkable schedule of a small business owner. On April 8, 1979, the surveillance produced its first significant result. At 11:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, a man entered the dry cleaning establishment and spent approximately 8 minutes inside. He was in his mid to late 40s, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with brown hair graying at the temples and a slight build. He carried a brown briefcase and wore dark trousers, a light blue collared shirt, and a windbreaker. He left carrying, in addition to his briefcase, what appeared to be a dry-cleaned suit in a plastic garment bag. Surveillance photographs were taken. The man walked to a gray 1976 Ford LTD parked on a side street adjacent to the strip mall. Agents recorded the license plate number. The plate was registered to Thomas Edward Hartley, 46, of 2214 West Haven Drive, Falls Church, Virginia. His employment, identified through a federal records query, was listed as Senior Intelligence Analyst, Defense Intelligence Agency. The identification of Hartley as a person of interest initiated a separate and considerably more sensitive investigation, designated internally as Operation Inkwell. The name appeared on no document that left the Washington field office's secure facilities. The investigation initially involved only 5 people: Marsh, Garrett, 2 experienced counterintelligence agents, Sandra Pacheco and James Wendell, and a supervisory official at FBI headquarters who had authorized the additional resources required. A 6th person, a senior official at the Defense Intelligence Agency, briefed under strict compartmentation protocols, assisted in understanding the specific classified materials Hartley had access to, information essential for evaluating the potential scope of any damage. Operation Inkwell faced a fundamental problem. The circumstantial chain connecting Hartley to Soviet intelligence was suggestive, but far from sufficient for arrest. Hartley had visited a dry cleaning business. The fact that the business appeared to have a connection to a Czech intelligence cutout did not establish that he knew of or participated in any intelligence activity. What the FBI needed was direct evidence of Hartley passing classified material to Soviet intelligence, or surveillance evidence demonstrating active participation in an espionage operation. Marsh authorized physical surveillance of Hartley while simultaneously seeking court authorization for technical surveillance of his home telephone line under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which had been enacted in 1978. Physical surveillance began on April 14, 1979, with rotating teams of agents conducting coverage of Hartley's daily movements. They documented his commute to Arlington Hall Station, his lunch breaks at nearby restaurants, and his evening drive home. They photographed him at gas stations, at a grocery store, and at a hardware store. They followed him on Saturday mornings when he drove his son Kevin to soccer practice at a field in nearby McLean. On 3 occasions over 4 weeks, they documented him driving alone to a marina in Alexandria, boarding a small motorboat, and proceeding out onto the Potomac for periods of 2 to 3 hours before returning to the dock. For the first 4 weeks, his routine appeared entirely consistent with the documented pattern of life of a senior government analyst approaching his late 40s. There were no meetings with known Soviet intelligence officers. There were no visits to locations that had previously been identified as dead drop sites. There was nothing in the accumulated documentation of his movements that would have looked unusual to anyone who did not know what they were looking for. Then, on May 12, 1979, at approximately 12:45 p.m. on a Sunday, Hartley drove from Falls Church, west on Route 7, and then north toward Leesburg, Virginia. He drove at a consistent pace until he turned onto a smaller county road that wound through a forested area approximately 4 miles east of Leesburg. He pulled into a small graveled area serving as a trailhead for a walking path through the woods. He took his briefcase from the back seat, walked to the trailhead, and entered the forest. Agents on foot surveillance, positioned at various points along possible routes from their prior reconnaissance of the area, followed at distances of 100 yards or more. After approximately 20 minutes of walking, Hartley stopped at a point where the trail passed a concrete drainage culvert carrying runoff from higher ground to the south. He knelt beside the culvert, his back to the trail, and spent approximately 30 seconds at that location. Agents positioned to observe with long telephoto lenses documented what appeared to be Hartley removing something from inside his jacket and placing it beneath the concrete cap that sealed the culvert's mouth on the north side of the trail. He then stood, brushed dirt from his trousers, and walked back the way he had come. He returned to his vehicle and drove home, arriving at approximately 3:20 p.m. The FBI now faced a critical operational decision. They could retrieve whatever Hartley had left at the culvert immediately, which would allow them to determine what had been compromised but would alert Soviet intelligence when their courier arrived to find the drop empty. Alternatively, they could document the package's contents without disturbing it and allow the Soviet retrieval to proceed, which meant classified information would reach Soviet hands, but which would allow them to document the full operation and potentially identify additional participants in the network. Marsh's recommendation, approved by FBI headquarters after consultation with senior officials, was to photograph the package's contents without removing it and then allow the retrieval to proceed under surveillance. A technically trained FBI agent accessed the culvert during a 3-hour window in the early morning of May 13th, carefully photographed the contents of a sealed waterproof container, replaced the container precisely as found, and withdrew. The operation left no trace of interference. The container held 2 items, a roll of Minox film and a folded sheet of paper containing, in Hartley's handwriting, reference notes that appeared to index the photographed material. The Minox film, developed from copies made by the FBI's technical team, contained images of 11 pages of a classified DIA analytical product regarding estimated improvements to Soviet anti-satellite capabilities. Material rated at the sensitive compartmented information level. Soviet intelligence retrieved the dead drop on May 16, 1979. The courier, a man photographed by FBI surveillance teams but not immediately identified, entered the forest from a different access point, recovered the container from the culvert, and departed. Subsequent analysis of the surveillance photographs identified him as a low-level employee of the Soviet embassy's administrative staff, one of a category of diplomatic personnel whose status shielded them from prosecution, but whose identification was valuable for understanding the operation's structure. The evidence the FBI now possessed, Hartley's documented placement of a dead drop containing classified material, subsequently retrieved by a Soviet embassy employee, was sufficient to arrest him, but Marsh wanted more before moving. He wanted to understand the full scope of what Hartley had compromised and to know whether there were other assets connected to the same network. Surveillance continued through May and into June 1979. The wiretap on Hartley's home telephone, authorized by a federal judge under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, produced 2 calls during this period containing language consistent with Soviet operational communication protocols. One call, received on June 3rd, lasted 41 seconds. A male caller stated that the conference schedule had been moved up and that the final presentation should be ready by the 17th. Hartley responded that he understood and would have the materials prepared. Voice analysis suggested with moderate confidence that the caller was Menshov, though the audio quality and brevity of the call made definitive identification impossible. The FBI's assessment was that Hartley had been instructed to prepare another package for delivery by June 17th. The decision was made to arrest him before any further classified information could be transferred. Authorization was approved at FBI headquarters on June 16, 1979. At 6:48 a.m. on the morning of June 18, 1979, 6 FBI agents arrived at 2214 West Haven Drive in Falls Church, Virginia. The morning was warm for mid-June, the air thick with humidity that had settled over northern Virginia overnight. The street was quiet, a weekday morning not yet fully underway. The agents, who had positioned surveillance vehicles on the block the previous night and maintained overnight coverage, approached the front door. Barbara Hartley answered. She was wearing a bathrobe and appeared to have been awake for only a few minutes. She looked at the 6 agents, at the badges they displayed, at the document one of them extended toward her, without immediate comprehension. Special Agent Sandra Pacheco, leading the arrest team, identified herself and told Barbara they had a warrant for Thomas Hartley's arrest and needed to know if he was inside. Barbara said he was in the kitchen. Thomas Hartley was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in a section of the Washington Post. He looked up when the agents entered. His face showed a sequence of expressions that moved quickly from surprise to something that might have been recognition, then settled into a flatness that suggested a man drawing on a reserve of self-control he had perhaps been preparing to need for a long time. He set down his coffee cup carefully, as if concerned about spilling it, and told them he would need to speak with a lawyer. He was advised of his rights, handcuffed, and walked to one of the FBI vehicles. Barbara remained in the doorway, holding her robe closed at the collar with one hand. Kevin Hartley, then 16 years old, came downstairs after hearing voices. He reached the bottom of the stairs in time to see his father being walked out the front door in handcuffs. He would later describe standing there in his pajamas, unable to understand what he was looking at. It was an image he would carry for the rest of his life. Joanne Hartley, 19, and completing her first year at George Mason University, was not at home. She was reached by telephone later that morning by her mother, who told her only that something had happened with her father and that she needed to come home. According to Joanne's later account, the call was so abbreviated and her mother's voice so controlled and strange that she understood before arriving at the house that the situation was catastrophic, though she could not have said why she knew this. The search of the Hartley residence, conducted under warrant, while Barbara and Kevin sat in the living room, watched over by one agent, produced substantial evidence. In Hartley's home office, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large wooden desk, investigators found a Minox camera of the type documented in the dead drop material. They found 5 rolls of exposed Minox film in a locked desk drawer, the key to which was in Hartley's jacket pocket and had to be obtained under receipt at the Washington field office. They found $2,400 in cash, bundled in denominations of 50s and 100s, inside a hollowed-out copy of an unabridged dictionary on the middle shelf of the office bookcase. They found handwritten notes in a partial substitution cipher that FBI cryptologists would reconstruct in full within 72 hours, and they found, at the bottom of a filing cabinet drawer behind a row of hanging folders containing personal financial records, a small notebook in which Hartley had recorded, in his own hand and in a combination of abbreviations and coded references, what appeared to be a log of his dead drops, dates, locations, general descriptions of the material left, dating back to approximately 1924. The notebook, numbered as Exhibit 12 in the federal prosecution, was among the most damaging items recovered. It did not name Soviet contacts or identify the KGB structure he had operated within, but it provided a roadmap of the operation's scope and duration that aligned with and significantly extended the FBI's investigative findings. Thomas Hartley was charged in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia with conspiracy to gather and transmit national defense information to a foreign government with unauthorized disclosure of classified information at the sensitive compartmented information level, and with failure to report contact with foreign intelligence officers, a legal requirement applicable to all individuals holding security clearances. The charges carried a potential maximum sentence of life imprisonment on the most serious count. His arraignment was held on June 20th, 1979. He entered a plea of not guilty. His attorney, Charles Morrill, a Washington criminal defense lawyer who specialized in national security cases, requested bail, arguing that his client had no prior criminal record and posed no flight risk. The prosecution opposed bail on national security grounds. The presiding judge, Senior Judge Elliot Kaufman of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, denied the request and remanded Hartley to the custody of the U.S. Marshals. The pretrial period extended through the summer and fall of 1979. Complicated by the classification review the Justice Department was required to undertake to determine what evidence could be presented in open court without further compromising intelligence sources and methods. As the evidence against him accumulated through the discovery process and the full scope of the FBI's investigation became apparent to his legal team, Hartley agreed in October 1979 to plead guilty to the 2 most serious charges and to cooperate fully with government investigators in exchange for a prosecution recommendation of 30 years rather than life imprisonment. The cooperation agreement required Hartley to provide a complete account of his recruitment, his handling by Soviet intelligence, every piece of classified information he could recall providing, and everything he understood about the operation's structure and protocols. The FBI debriefing sessions ran from late October 1979 through March 1980 and produced hundreds of pages of notes and analysis that formed the basis for what became known within the intelligence community as the Inkwell Assessment. a classified damage report evaluating the harm Hartley's espionage had caused to U.S. intelligence programs and military capabilities. The sentencing hearing was held on March 14, 1980, before Judge Kaufman. The government presented evidence of the scope of the espionage. 43 separate classified documents or analytical products identified as having been photographed and delivered to Soviet intelligence over roughly 6 years, encompassing materials classified at the secret, top secret, and sensitive compartmented information levels. The classified damage assessment, presented to the judge in a sealed filing, concluded that Hartley's espionage had provided Soviet military planners with significant insight into American analytical methods and had potentially allowed them to identify gaps in American collection capabilities that could be exploited to conceal Soviet military activities from U.S. detection. Hartley's attorney submitted letters of character support from former colleagues who had been unaware of his intelligence activities, along with a psychological assessment arguing that Hartley had been cultivated by a sophisticated recruitment operation and that his actions reflected rationalization and compartmentalization rather than genuine ideological hostility to the United States. The attorney also emphasized the impact that a lengthy sentence would have on Barbara Hartley and on Kevin and Joanne. Hartley himself, given the opportunity to address the court, spoke for approximately 8 minutes. His statement was measured and acknowledging in a way that several courtroom observers described as careful rather than fully unguarded, as if he had constructed a statement that acknowledged wrongdoing without quite examining it in its full dimensions. He said he had been wrong, that the harm he had caused was real, and that he was sorry. He did not attempt to fully explain himself. Judge Kaufman, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the cooperation agreement and Hartley's assistance with the damage assessment as genuine mitigating factors. He noted, however, that the scope of the espionage, 6 years, 43 identified compromises, access to some of the most sensitive analytical programs the U.S. intelligence community operated, made leniency beyond the agreement's terms inappropriate. He sentenced Thomas Hartley to 35 years in federal prison, 5 years beyond the prosecution's recommendation, citing the calculated and sustained nature of Hartley's deception of his colleagues, his employer, and his family. The immediate consequences for the Hartley family extended well beyond the courtroom. Barbara Hartley learned the general nature of what her husband had done within a day of his arrest, when FBI agents explained that he was charged with espionage and that the investigation had been ongoing for several months. She sat in her living room and listened to an agent explain that her husband had been providing classified intelligence to the Soviet Union for approximately 6 years, throughout what she had experienced as a more or less ordinary marriage and family life, and that she herself was not under investigation. She asked very few questions. The ones she did ask were precise. How long had they been watching him? Had they been watching her? Did anyone believe she had known? The agent confirmed that no one suspected her involvement. She nodded, thanked him, and did not speak again during the remainder of the interview. Those who knew her well in the months following the arrest described a woman who reorganized herself around a new set of circumstances with the same methodical practicality she had always applied to difficult problems, except that this problem had no practical solution, only a set of ongoing facts to be managed. What changed was not visible in any single way. It was subtler and more complete than that. A certain careful steadiness that those who had known her before the arrest recognized as something different from the calm she had always projected. Kevin's experience of the weeks and months that followed was far less controlled. He was 16, and he had seen his father in handcuffs. He went to school the following Monday and attempted to function in the normal social environment of his high school, carrying that image in his memory and with no vocabulary adequate to process it. His mother explained to him what she understood, which was incomplete, and what she chose to tell him, which was further filtered by her desire to protect him from information she judged too complex for a 16-year-old to absorb. What he absorbed, from his mother's filtered account and from the coverage of his father's arrest and charges that appeared in the Washington Post and other regional newspapers, was a version of events that was accurate in outline and indigestible in human terms. He became, according to teachers who later spoke with researchers, withdrawn in the months following the arrest. His grades, previously solid, declined. Some of his friends maintained their friendships unchanged. Others became awkward and uncertain. A small number were actively unkind. Joanne was 19 and in some respects better equipped to process what had happened, though not necessarily better equipped to bear it. She had established a life at university more independent of the family and had a somewhat more developed framework for understanding how her father's choices might be contextualized within larger systems. But she also understood more precisely than Kevin could at his age what the word espionage meant and what her father had done. This understanding produced in her a kind of retroactive reinterpretation of her childhood, a rereading of memories of her father that now carried a layer of concealment she had never perceived at the time she was living inside them. Thomas Hartley was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Petersburg, Virginia in April 1980, where he began serving his 35-year sentence. Barbara visited twice in the first year. The visits were, according to court documentation associated with subsequent divorce proceedings, difficult for both parties. Hartley's attempts to explain himself, to provide the context and rationale he had given the FBI debriefing team, failed to produce the understanding he hoped for, in part because Barbara was not primarily seeking an explanation. She was seeking something that could not be provided, a way to understand how the man she had been married to for 17 years had been, simultaneously, someone she did not know. She stopped visiting in 1981. In February 1982, she retained a divorce attorney. The divorce was finalized in November 1982. Court documents cited irreconcilable differences. Barbara reverted to her maiden name, Walsh, and returned to full-time work as a librarian, taking a position at the Fairfax County Public Library System. The income was substantially less than what the family had been accustomed to, and the house on West Haven Drive, which carried a mortgage that had been manageable on two incomes, became a financial strain. She sold it in the spring of 1983 and moved with Kevin to a smaller townhouse in Alexandria. Kevin Hartley graduated from high school in 1981, a year after his father's sentencing. He enrolled at Northern Virginia Community College, less because he had a particular academic plan than because it was an available next step that required less investment than a four-year university. He struggled academically in his first year, withdrew from several classes, and completed a two-year associate's degree in 1984. He worked a succession of jobs through his mid-20s: warehouse work, delivery driving, a period managing a sporting goods store that did not require the professional identity or trajectory he had not yet managed to construct for himself. According to an interview Kevin gave in 2003 to a researcher studying the families of convicted spies, his 20s were defined in large part by a sustained effort to understand his father's choices that he could never quite resolve. He began visiting his father in prison when he was in his early 20s, going initially at his mother's suggestion and then continuing because the conversations were, despite everything, ones he found necessary. His father attempted, across multiple prison visits, to explain the sequence of decisions that had led him to Petersburg. Kevin found these explanations partial and unsatisfying, not because he thought his father was lying, but because the explanations never quite accounted for the fact that his father had made those choices while also being, simultaneously, Kevin's father, driving him to soccer practice, helping him with homework, cooking Saturday morning pancakes. Joanne's estrangement from her father was more complete. She visited him once in prison in the winter of 1981 and did not return. In the letter she wrote him several years later, a letter Hartley would carry with him for the remainder of his life, she told him that she did not intend to maintain a relationship with him. She did not say this with cruelty, he recalled, but with the careful directness of someone who had thought precisely about what she needed to communicate. She said she hoped he was not suffering more than was appropriate. She said she had made her peace with what he had done. She said she was not able to reconcile the father she had known with the choices he had made, and had decided that the most honest response to that irreconcilability was to not pretend she could. He kept the letter. Viktor Alexandrovich Menshov. the KGB officer whose misdialed telephone number had initiated the chain of events that exposed the Inkwell operation, was declared persona non grata by the U.S. State Department in October 1979, several months after Hartley's arrest. He returned to the Soviet Union along with 3 other embassy officials believed to be connected to the operation. His subsequent career in Soviet and then Russian intelligence, if he continued in it, is not documented in any publicly available record. Peter Havlicek, the dry cleaning establishment operator who had served as a cutout relay in the operation, was arrested in June 1979, contemporaneously with Hartley. He cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years, entered a guilty plea, and was released in 1986. According to available records, he remained in the United States and continued to operate a small business in the Washington suburbs. Margaret Reilly, whose call to the FBI after-hours duty number had set the investigation in motion, received a commendation from the FBI Director's Office in 1980. She retired from the Bureau's Washington Field Office in 1987 after 22 years in the Support Services Division. She declined several requests for interviews from journalists covering Cold War espionage cases in the years following her retirement. She died in March 1993 at the age of 66. Howard Garrett, the counterintelligence agent who had taken Reilly's call and recognized its potential significance, rose to supervisory rank and was assigned to the FBI's headquarters counterintelligence division in the mid-1980s. He retired in 1994 and gave occasional lectures at the FBI Academy in Quantico, using the Inkwell case as an example of the investigative importance of following seemingly minor leads. Donald Marsh, who had supervised the investigation from its first thread to its conclusion, was promoted to senior supervisory rank before his own retirement in 1988. Thomas Hartley served 18 years of his 35-year sentence. He was released on parole in September 1998 at the age of 65. The Cold War had been over for nearly a decade. The Soviet Union had dissolved in 1991. The KGB had been reorganized and renamed. Several of the programs whose analytical products he had photographed and delivered to Soviet intelligence had been substantially changed or superseded by technologies and methodologies that did not exist when he had committed his espionage. The strategic landscape he had operated within, the particular configuration of Cold War tensions and capabilities that had given his information whatever significance it possessed, had been replaced by a different world. He was released to a halfway house in Richmond, Virginia, and eventually settled in a small apartment near a bus line that connected him to a job doing document processing for a law firm. He had no security clearance and would not have one again. He had no boat. He had the apartment, the job, and on occasional weekends, visits from Kevin, whose willingness to maintain the relationship Hartley would describe in later years with an evident awareness that it was more than he had reason to expect. In 2007, Thomas Hartley was interviewed at his Richmond apartment by a researcher at Georgetown University, compiling an oral history of Cold War intelligence cases. He was 74 years old and in declining health from a heart condition diagnosed several years earlier. The interview, portions of which were later published in an academic collection on Cold War espionage, found him in a reflective mode somewhat different from the controlled posture he had maintained through his debriefings and his sentencing hearing nearly 3 decades earlier. He spoke about Joanne's letter with what the researcher described as a sustained and unresolved grief, the kind that had not softened over the years since he had received it in prison. He said it had clarified something for him that he had until then been evading, that the harm he had caused was not primarily to national security, though he acknowledged that harm is real, but to specific people who had not chosen to be proximate to his choices, and who had nonetheless borne significant portions of their consequences. When asked about his motivations, whether he still believed what he had told himself at the time, that he had been contributing to Cold War stability, he gave an answer more searching than any version he had offered before. He said he now suspected that the political conviction had been genuine, but had also been useful. It had allowed him to do something he had other reasons for doing, and he had never fully examined which part was driving and which part was being driven. The intellectual engagement had been real. The satisfaction of feeling valued by people who treated his work as important had been real. He could not determine, even now, which of those things had mattered most. What he was certain of, he said, was that none of them had justified what happened to his children. He spoke about Kevin with gratitude. He said the visits Kevin had made, across years when Kevin had every reason to stay away, had been more than he deserved, and he knew it. When asked whether his espionage had accomplished anything at all, he was quiet for a moment before answering that he did not know. He said the question of whether any information he had provided had influenced any specific Soviet decision was essentially unanswerable, and that the people who most needed protection from the miscalculation he had claimed to be preventing had been harmed by his choices, not protected by them. Thomas Hartley died in Richmond, Virginia on April 4th, 2015, at the age of 82. He died of complications from heart disease. He was survived by his daughter and son, and by Barbara Walsh, his former wife of 17 years. The obituary, published by a local Richmond newspaper, listed his death date, his birth date, and his survivors. It made no mention of his conviction or his imprisonment. Joanne and Kevin both attended a small graveside service. Barbara Walsh attended as well, by that time 79 years old, having retired from the Fairfax County Library System in 2004 and living quietly in a townhouse in Alexandria. Kevin's account of the service, shared with the journalist the following year, was brief. He said he had spent 36 years, from the morning of his father's arrest until the afternoon he stood at his father's grave, trying to hold two things in his mind simultaneously: that his father had loved him, and that his father had made choices whose consequences had taken Kevin most of his adult life to absorb. He said he had never fully resolved that contradiction. He said he was not sure it was meant to be resolved. The technical information that Thomas Hartley provided to Soviet intelligence between 1973 and 1979 became largely obsolete within a decade as analytical methodologies and collection technologies advanced. Whether his espionage actually affected any specific military or strategic outcome is impossible to determine with certainty. Intelligence operations by their nature involve the accumulation of many pieces of information assembled into larger pictures by analysts and planners. It is possible that material from Hartley influenced Soviet military planning in ways that have never been made public and may never be known. It is also possible that the information was received, analyzed, and ultimately had little practical impact. What the historical record does not contain is any specific Soviet military decision that can be traced to Hartley's material. The Hartley case carries a quality that is difficult to set aside when examining it in full: that the exposure of a 6-year intelligence operation, one that compromised 43 of the Defense Intelligence Agency's most sensitive analytical products, was triggered not by a mole within the Soviet embassy, not by a defector, not by a signals intelligence breakthrough at the National Security Agency, but by a single digit transposed in a 10-digit telephone number. Viktor Menshov placed a routine contact call on the evening of March 7, 1979, and reached the wrong house. He reached specifically the home of a woman whose 14 years of experience at the FBI had prepared her to understand, at least partially, at least enough, that what she had just heard was not an ordinary wrong number call. If the transposed number had connected to any one of the dozens of other private residences in the same exchange, the call would almost certainly have been forgotten before the person who answered had returned to whatever they had been doing. The operation might have continued for another year, or 2, or 5. The 43rd classified document Hartley photographed might have become the 60th or the 75th. The broader questions the case raises about accountability are ones that the legal system addressed in formal terms, but that the human dimensions of the case do not fully resolve. The legal proceedings established what Hartley had done and imposed consequences the court judged proportionate to the harm. What they could not address was the anatomy of the self-deception, how a man had spent 6 years carefully compartmentalizing a double existence while maintaining an internal narrative about his purpose that required a sustained act of rationalization, one that only fully collapsed when the external consequences made avoidance impossible. Hartley made choices. He chose to engage with the Soviet intelligence recruiter. He chose to provide classified information. He chose to accept payment. He chose to continue for 6 years. He chose to lie to his wife, his colleagues, and himself about what he was doing and why. Those choices were his, and he bore legal and moral responsibility for them. But he made those choices within a world divided by Cold War tensions, in a professional context where genuine intellectual concerns about policy distortion had been patiently cultivated into something that served purposes entirely beyond the ones he told himself he was serving. The man who recruited him had spent 18 months identifying and working a vulnerability before asking for anything. This does not remove Hartley's agency. It contextualizes the conditions under which that agency was exercised. Kevin and Joanne bear no responsibility for any of it. They were children who loved their father, had no knowledge of his activities, were traumatized by his arrest and its aftermath, and spent decades dealing with consequences they did not deserve. Their experience represents a cost that appears in no official accounting of the case, not in the damage assessment, not in the sentencing memorandum, not in any of the legal documents that measure what Hartley's espionage cost the United States government. But it was a cost. It was paid by two people who had nothing to do with the decision that incurred it. Thomas Hartley was 40 years old when he first placed classified material in a dead drop in a Virginia forest. He was 46 when a transposed telephone number set the clock running on his exposure, and 46 when he was arrested. He was 65 when he was released, and 82 when he died. The Soviet Union he had spied for had ceased to exist 14 years before his death. The classified programs he had compromised had been superseded by technologies that made them obsolete. What remained, at the end, were specific human costs that could not be superseded. The years his children had spent processing what he had done. The decades his wife had spent building a life that did not include him. The particular weight of knowing that the harm you caused cannot be undone by the time you fully understand it. The photograph taken at the dead drop site in the Leesburg forest, frame after frame of Thomas Hartley kneeling beside a drainage culvert in khaki trousers and a windbreaker, shows an ordinary-looking middle-aged man in a posture that could be anything, examining something on the trail, retying a shoelace, picking up a piece of litter. There is nothing in the image that announces what is actually happening. That perhaps is what it most honestly conveys, that the acts carrying the greatest consequences are often the ones that look, from the outside, exactly like everything else. A wrong number, 12 seconds, a woman standing at her kitchen counter, deciding that the call she had just received was worth reporting to someone who might understand it. Everything else followed from that.